At 4:34 p.m. on the 3rd of April 1974, a thunderstorm cell near the Tennessee River in northern Alabama began to rotate. It was not yet a tornado, but the conditions were primed for disaster. The sky had turned a sickly green. The air was warm and heavy, thick with humidity that clung to the skin. Across the state, weather watchers had been monitoring a severe weather outbreak that was already producing reports of large hail and damaging winds. But no one yet understood the scale of what was coming. The town of Tanner, Alabama, a small unincorporated community in Limestone County, sat directly in the path of something that would rewrite the history of American meteorology. At 4:38 p.m., a funnel cloud touched down just west of the community. Within minutes, it had grown into a wedge tornado nearly a mile wide. The first tornado of the day had arrived. What happened that afternoon in Tanner was not a single event. It was a sequence of cascading failures, warnings that arrived too late, decisions made in seconds, and forces of nature that overwhelmed every human attempt at preparation. The tornado that struck at 4:38 p.m. was an F5 on the Fujita scale, the highest rating possible. Winds were estimated at more than 300 miles per hour. The tornado carved a path of destruction that was 31 miles long, moving northeast at roughly 50 miles per hour. It hit Tanner without warning in the traditional sense. The National Weather Service had issued a tornado watch hours earlier, but a watch is not a warning. A watch means conditions are favorable. A warning means a tornado has been spotted or indicated on radar. In 1974, radar technology was limited. The WSR-57 radar network, then the backbone of the national system, could detect precipitation but did not have the resolution to see rotation signatures the way modern Doppler radar can. Meteorologists relied on visual confirmation from spotters and law enforcement. In rural northern Alabama, those spotters were few and far between. The first sign that something was wrong came from the sky itself. Witnesses later described a sound like a freight train, a deep rumbling that grew louder until it drowned out every other noise. The pressure dropped. Ears popped. Animals behaved strangely. Dogs ran for cover. Birds went silent. Then the wall of wind arrived. The tornado struck homes, mobile homes, schools, churches, and businesses with a force that defied comprehension. Entire houses were swept clean from their foundations. Trees were debarked, stripped of their branches, reduced to splintered stumps. Cars were thrown hundreds of yards and wrapped around telephone poles. The ground itself was scoured, with topsoil removed in long strips, leaving behind bare earth. The tornado did not discriminate. It took everything in its path. The first casualties came quickly. Families huddled in bathrooms and basements, but a direct hit from an F5 tornado leaves no safe place. Mobile homes, which were common in the rural South, offered no protection at all. They were simply lifted, torn apart, and scattered across fields. In Tanner, the tornado struck a residential area where many families lived in manufactured homes. The death toll mounted within minutes. 28 people would die in Tanner that day, but that number only tells part of the story. The tornado injured more than 200 others, many of them critically. Survivors emerged from the debris to find their neighbors dead, their homes gone, and the landscape transformed into something unrecognizable. The tornado continued northeast, cutting through the countryside, leaving a scar that would be visible from the air for years. The National Weather Service in Huntsville, roughly 20 miles southeast of Tanner, had issued a severe thunderstorm warning earlier in the afternoon. But a severe thunderstorm warning is not a tornado warning. The distinction matters. Severe thunderstorms can produce damaging winds and large hail, but a tornado is a different beast entirely. The technology in 1974 simply could not identify the rotation that was already occurring inside the storm cell. The radar operator in Huntsville saw a hook echo, a classic signature of a tornadic thunderstorm, but the significance of that signature was not yet widely understood. The concept of the hook echo had been identified in the 1950s, but it took years for the knowledge to become operational practice. By the time the radar operator recognized what was happening, the tornado was already on the ground. At 4:45 p.m., the first tornado began to lift near the community of Belmina, roughly 11 minutes after it had touched down. The destruction was catastrophic. The path was a swath of devastation that measured nearly a mile across in some places, but the storm system was not finished. The same thunderstorm that produced the first tornado continued to strengthen. New rotation developed. At 5:15 p.m., a second tornado touched down in the same general area, along the same storm track, moving northeast again. This was not a separate event. It was a continuation of the same supercell thunderstorm. The first tornado had been violent. The second was worse. The second tornado touched down near the town of Harvest, Alabama, and moved directly toward Tanner again. The community that had just been destroyed by the first tornado had no time to recover. Emergency responders were still digging through debris, still triaging the wounded, still counting the dead when the second tornado arrived. It was also an F5. Its path overlapped the path of the first tornado. In some places, the two tracks were nearly identical. The second tornado carved a path that was 43 miles long, even longer than the first. It destroyed everything that the first tornado had missed. It also hit areas that had been spared the first time. The second tornado killed another 28 people, but the number is uncertain because the communities were already in chaos. The bodies from the first tornado had not even been recovered. The double strike was unprecedented. No community in American history had ever been hit by two separate F5 tornadoes on the same day, let alone within hours of each other, let alone along the same path. Tanner, Alabama became a case study in catastrophic weather. The event also raised questions that would haunt meteorologists for decades. Could the first tornado have been forecast more precisely? Could the second tornado have been predicted? Was there a way to warn the community that another strike was coming, especially when the first responders were themselves victims? The answers were not simple. The supercell thunderstorm that produced the Tanner tornadoes was part of a much larger system. On April 3, 1974, a powerful low-pressure system was moving across the central United States. A cold front extending southward from the low clashed with warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico. The combination created conditions that were ideal for severe thunderstorms. What made this day different was the strength and persistence of the atmospheric instability. The jet stream was positioned directly over the region, providing strong wind shear that caused thunderstorms to rotate. The result was an outbreak of tornadoes that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Deep South. 148 tornadoes touched down over a span of 18 hours. 315 people were killed. More than 5,000 were injured. The outbreak destroyed entire communities across 13 states. In Alabama alone, 77 people died. The town of Ginn in western Alabama was also hit by an F5 tornado that killed 23 people. The town of Jasper was hit by an F4. The town of Cullman was devastated by an F4 that destroyed much of the downtown area, but Tanner was the worst. The double strike made it unique. How could this have happened? The answer is partly meteorological and partly human. Meteorologically, the supercell that produced the Tanner tornadoes exhibited a behavior that was not well understood in 1974. Modern research has shown that some supercells can produce multiple tornadoes in sequence, particularly when the storm is cyclic. A cyclic supercell generates a new tornado as the previous one dissipates, often with very little gap between the two. The Tanner supercell was a textbook example of cyclic tornadogenesis, but the textbooks had not been written yet. The National Weather Service did not have the observational tools or the forecasting models to predict that behavior. The human side of the equation involves warnings, communication, and preparedness. In 1974, the system for disseminating tornado warnings was limited. Television and radio stations could broadcast warnings, but not everyone was listening. The NOAA Weather Radio network was still in its infancy. Sirens were not widespread in rural Alabama. Many communities had no warning system at all. People relied on the sky, on the sound of thunder, on word of mouth. When the first tornado struck Tanner, many residents did not know it was coming until they saw it. When the second tornado struck, many did not believe it could happen again. The emergency response after the first tornado was heroic but overwhelmed. Volunteer fire departments, sheriffs, deputies, and ordinary citizens rushed to the scene to search for survivors. They worked without heavy equipment, using their hands, shovels, and chainsaws to clear debris. Ambulances carried the injured to hospitals in Huntsville and Decatur. Triage centers were set up in churches and school gymnasiums. But the second tornado struck before the rescue effort could be organized. It caught first responders in the open. Some of them became victims themselves. The second tornado killed people who were already injured from the first. It buried rescuers under debris they had just cleared. It destroyed the equipment and vehicles that were being used to transport the wounded. The aftermath was a scene of complete devastation. The town of Tanner was effectively erased. Of the roughly 200 homes in the community, fewer than a dozen remained standing. The post office was gone. The school was gone. The church was gone. The volunteer fire station was gone. The landscape was so altered that survivors could not orient themselves. Familiar landmarks had vanished. Roads were impassable. Power lines were down across every route in and out of the area. The only way to reach some survivors was on foot across fields and through woods that had been stripped bare. The National Guard was activated. The Red Cross set up relief stations. The governor declared a state of emergency, but the recovery was slow. The injured were treated in hospital hallways because the emergency rooms were overwhelmed. The dead were collected and taken to temporary morgues. Bodies were identified by clothing, by jewelry, by scars, because there were no photographs to match. The process of identification took days, then weeks. The funerals were held in shifts because there were too many to hold at once. What investigators found in the weeks and months after the Tanner tornadoes was a pattern that would shape the future of severe weather forecasting. First, they found that the radar data from April 3rd showed clear signatures of the supercell structure, but the technology to interpret that data in real time did not exist. Second, they found that the communication network for warnings was fragmented. Counties used different radio frequencies. Some counties had no direct line to the National Weather Service. Third, they found that the public did not understand the difference between a watch and a warning, and that many people did not know what to do when a warning was issued. The systems that failed in Tanner were not the fault of any single person. They were the result of a weather service that was underfunded, understaffed, and outdated. The limitations of 1970's technology meant that forecasters were working with data that was hours old by the time they saw it. The limitations of 1970's communication meant that warnings traveled at the speed of telephone calls and radio broadcasts. The limitations of 1970's public education meant that most people had never been taught what to do when a tornado struck. But the event still matters. The 1974 Super Outbreak was a turning point in American meteorology. It led directly to the development of modern Doppler radar, which can detect rotation inside thunderstorms and provide earlier warnings. It led to the creation of the modern watch and warning system, with clearly defined terminology and procedures. It led to the expansion of the NOAA Weather Radio network, which now provides automated warnings directly to homes and businesses. It led to improved training for spotters and emergency managers. It led to a culture of preparedness that did not exist before. The people of Tanner did not die in vain. Their deaths accelerated changes that have saved countless lives in the decades since. But the question remains, could more have been done in 1974? The answer is yes. The technology existed, at least in prototype form. The knowledge existed, at least in academic research. The systems had been proposed, at least on paper. What was missing was the political will, the funding, and the institutional urgency to turn that knowledge into practice. It took a catastrophe to create change. That is the pattern of American disaster response. We wait until people die, then we fix the problem. Tanner is a monument to that pattern. The second tornado struck Tanner at approximately 4:35 p.m. Central Standard Time. The first tornado had passed through around 4 p.m. In the intervening 35 minutes, rescue efforts had begun. Neighbors were pulling debris off their families. Firefighters from nearby volunteer departments had arrived. Ambulances from Limestone County and Madison County were on scene. The wounded were being loaded onto stretchers. The dead were being covered with sheets. Then the sky turned green again. The wind shifted. Those who had survived the first strike recognized the sound. It was a roar, low and continuous, like a freight train on a track that no longer existed. Hazel McCracken was 23 years old. She had been helping dig out her neighbor's family when the second tornado came. She later described the moment as a wall of debris advancing from the southwest. She ran for her car, but the car was already lifted and thrown. She survived by lying flat in a drainage ditch. The tornado passed over her. When she looked up, the house she had been standing in front of was gone. The people she had been helping were gone. The ambulance that had been parked at the crossroads was upside down in a field. The rescuers who had been working near the church were buried under the same rubble they had been clearing. The second tornado was as powerful as the first. It was rated F5 on the Fujita scale, with winds estimated at more than 300 miles per hour. It followed a path that was almost identical to the first tornado's path, overlapping the damaged swath by nearly 90%. That overlap was what made the disaster so catastrophic. The first tornado had already turned homes into piles of splinters. The second tornado pulverized those piles into dust. It scoured the ground down to the soil. It stripped bark from trees that had already been snapped. It carried debris away and then dropped it miles downwind. The bodies recovered after the second tornado were often impossible to separate from the debris. Rescuers used rakes and their hands. They worked in silence. There were no sirens, no shouts, only the sound of wind and the crunch of broken wood. The death toll from the two tornadoes combined was eventually set at 28 in the Tanner area, but the number was uncertain for days. Some victims were never formally identified. Some families were lost entirely, leaving no one to report them missing. How could the same community be hit twice in 30 minutes? The answer lies in the behavior of supercell thunderstorms. A cyclic supercell produces a sequence of tornadoes as its mesocyclone reorganizes. The first tornado usually dissipates when the rear flank downdraft wraps around the circulation and cuts off the inflow. But the storm itself does not stop. The mesocyclone can tighten again, and a new tornado can form, sometimes just a few miles to the east or northeast of where the old one dissipated. In Tanner, the second tornado formed almost directly over the same location. The storm had not moved far. The damage paths overlapped because the tornadoes were products of the same rotating updraft, and that updraft was essentially stationary for a period of time. Meteorologists in 1974 did not have a name for cyclic supercells. The concept had been described in research papers, but it was not part of operational forecasting. Forecasters in Nashville, Huntsville, and Birmingham were watching the same radar returns that showed a persistent hook echo over Limestone County. They issued warnings, but they could not see the inner structure of the storm. They could not tell that a second tornado was imminent. They could only watch the hook echo and wait. The National Weather Service office in Huntsville was understaffed. The radar used was the WSR-57, a World War II-era surplus system. It displayed precipitation intensity but not velocity. It could not detect rotation. It could not distinguish between a single tornado and a cyclic family. The forecaster on duty saw a large area of intense echoes and issued a severe thunderstorm warning. The tornado warning for Tanner had been issued based on spotter reports from the first tornado. When the second tornado struck, there was no time to issue a new warning. The storm was already on top of the community. After the outbreak, the National Severe Storms Laboratory in Norman, Oklahoma, began a detailed study of the Tanner storm. They analyzed the radar film. They reconstructed the storm's evolution minute by minute. They found that the mesocyclone had produced at least 4 separate tornadoes over its lifespan, 2 of which struck Tanner. The study became a landmark paper on cyclic tornadogenesis. It confirmed that the storm had behaved in a way that was predictable in theory but invisible to the operational network. The human consequences of that invisibility were measured not in numbers but in names. McCracken family lost 7 members, the Butlers lost 5, the Duncans lost 4, children were orphaned, grandparents died in the same collapse as their grandchildren. The community of Tanner had been a close-knit rural settlement where everyone knew everyone. After April 3, 1974, that community no longer existed. The survivors did not just lose homes, they lost the fabric of their daily life. The psychological impact was severe. Survivors reported nightmares for years. Some could not tolerate the sound of wind. Others moved away, unable to return to the place where they had seen so much death. The town itself never rebuilt. Today, Tanner is a collection of scattered houses and a few churches. There is no downtown, there is no main street, the post office never reopened. The school was consolidated with a nearby district. The landscape bears scars that are visible from satellite imagery. The investigation into the response revealed systemic failures. The communications network between the National Weather Service and local emergency managers was slow and unreliable. The telephone lines were jammed after the first tornado. The radio frequencies used by the various rescue agencies did not all match. Some dispatchers did not know which frequencies to use. The relay of warnings from the Weather Service to the public depended on television and radio stations, but many stations had gone off the air when their towers were damaged by the first storm. One lesson learned was the need for a reliable, redundant warning dissemination system. That led to the expansion of the NOAA Weather Radio network. In the years following 1974, the government funded the installation of hundreds of new transmitters. The system was designed to broadcast automated warnings directly to special radios that could be set to activate only for specific counties. It was not a perfect solution. Many people did not own such radios, but it was a step forward. Another lesson was the need for better radar. The WSR-57 had been adequate for detecting general storm intensity, but it was blind to rotation. The next generation of radar, the WSR-88D, was developed in the 1980s and deployed in the 1990s. That radar, known as Doppler, could detect the velocity of precipitation particles. It could identify a mesocyclone. It could show forecasters exactly where rotation was occurring and how strong it was. The deployment of the WSR-88D was directly motivated by disasters like the 1974 Super Outbreak, but technology alone was not enough. The culture of warnings had to change. In 1974, the National Weather Service used a system of watch bulletins and warning bulletins that were text-heavy and slow to interpret. Forecasters wrote statements on typewriters and sent them via teletype. The public had little understanding of the difference between a watch and a warning. After the outbreak, the Weather Service redesigned its products. The language was simplified. The graphics were standardized. The lead time for tornado warnings increased. The town of Tanner never got its warnings back, but the improvements saved lives in later years. In the 2011 Super Outbreak, which struck the same region, tornado warnings had average lead times of nearly 20 minutes. Doppler radar provided clear signatures of rotation. The public had been educated through drills and media campaigns. The death toll from the 2011 outbreak was still high, at over 300 people, but the number would have been far higher without the changes rooted in 1974. The people of Tanner were not forgotten. Every April 3rd, the Limestone County Emergency Management Agency holds a memorial service. The names of the dead are read aloud. The surviving families gather at the cemetery. The weather is often cold and gray. The service lasts about an hour. It is a quiet reminder of what happened when the sky turned green and the sound came twice. The documentary record of the Tanner tornadoes is stored in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration archives. The radar film is digitized. The damage surveys are scanned. The eyewitness statements are preserved. Researchers still study the event. They use modern computer models to simulate the storm and compare it to modern outbreaks. They find that the storm of April 3, 1974 was exceptional even by today's standards. The atmospheric parameters that day were at the extreme end of what is possible, but they also find that the same type of storm could happen again. Climate change is expected to increase the frequency and intensity of severe thunderstorms in parts of the United States. The region known as Dixie Alley, which includes northern Alabama, is already experiencing a shift in tornado activity. The traditional tornado alley in the Great Plains is seeing fewer tornado days, while the Southeast is seeing more. The population in the Southeast is larger and more vulnerable. Mobile homes are more common. The terrain is forested, making it harder to see approaching storms. Nighttime tornadoes are more frequent. Each of these factors increases risk. The Tanner tornadoes remain a case study in cascading failure. The meteorological failure was a lack of understanding about cyclic supercells. The communication failure was a lack of coordination and redundancy. The public preparedness failure was a lack of education and infrastructure. Each failure compounded the others. The result was a double disaster that killed people who were already trying to help. The lessons are not only for meteorologists, they are for anyone who manages risk. The pattern of waiting for catastrophe before making changes is deeply ingrained. It is visible in infrastructure in public health and emergency management. Tanner shows what that pattern costs. It shows that the second strike is often the deadliest. It shows that the best time to prepare is before the first tornado touches down. On the evening of April 3, 1974, the skies over Tanner finally cleared. The low-pressure system moved east. The tornado outbreak continued into the night with deadly storms in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio. The death toll rose hour by hour. By midnight, the nation knew something terrible had happened. The coverage on network television was extensive. President Richard Nixon declared a major disaster for several states. The Red Cross appealed for donations. The recovery began. In Tanner, the survivors gathered at the Methodist Church on Highway 301. The church itself had been destroyed, but the congregation met in the basement, which had survived. They prayed, they counted heads, they shared blankets and food brought by strangers from Huntsville. They did not know that their experience would become a turning point in the history of severe weather safety. They only knew that they had been hit twice and that many of those they loved were gone. The wind does not forget. The sky does not care about human plans. The only defense is preparation, and preparation is only as strong as the systems that support it. The Tanner tornadoes broke every system in place in 1974. The question for every generation since has been whether the systems have been rebuilt strong enough to withstand the next storm. The night of April 3, 1974, did not end at sunset. At 8:30 p.m., as the second Tanner tornado was still dissipating over the Tennessee border, the National Weather Service office in Nashville received word of another storm forming near Pulaski, Tennessee. That storm would produce a long-track tornado that carved through rural areas of Giles County before lifting near Columbia. The same supercell that had destroyed Tanner was still producing. Forecasters at the time had no name for what they were seeing. Today it is called cyclic supercell behavior. Back then it was simply described as the storm that would not die. At 9:15 p.m., a third tornado from that same parent thunderstorm touched down near Lawrenceburg, Tennessee. It was not as violent as the Tanner storms, but it still killed 2 people and injured dozens. The storm continued northeast through the night, eventually producing tornadoes in central Kentucky after midnight. The meteorologists watching the radar in Nashville did not have Doppler capability. They could see the storm's intensity on the reflectivity display, but they could not see the rotation. They issued warnings based on visual reports and general storm strength. They did not know that the same storm system had already killed 33 people in Alabama. Across the region, emergency services were overwhelmed. In Limestone County, the sheriff's office had lost 2 of its 3 patrol cars. The dispatch center was operating on battery power. The telephone lines were down in every direction. Amateur radio operators stepped in to fill the gap. They set up portable stations in the back of pickup trucks and relayed messages from the affected areas to the State Emergency Management Office in Montgomery. The amateur radio network, known as the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service, was one of the few communication systems that still functioned. Its operators stayed on the air for nearly 36 hours straight. The hospital in Athens, Alabama, received more than 200 injured patients in the first 4 hours after the tornadoes. The emergency room was designed for a fraction of that number. Medical staff worked by flashlight and propane lantern. The emergency generators kept the surgical lights on but not the hallways. Nurses triaged patients in the parking lot using the headlights of cars. Doctors performed amputations with instruments that had been sterilized in boiling water on a camp stove. Blood supplies ran low. The hospital put out a call for donors using a mobile radio unit. More than 300 people showed up at the hospital doors by dawn. At 11 p.m., the National Weather Service issued a special bulletin summarizing the outbreak. It stated that at least 50 tornadoes had touched down across the Midwest and South. It listed confirmed deaths in 11 states. The final number would be far higher. The bulletin was typed on a teletype machine and sent to wire services. It was the first time the public began to understand the scale of what had happened. Television networks interrupted regular programming. The coverage was fragmented because many local stations had lost their transmitting towers. In Huntsville, the ABC affiliate was off the air for 2 days. The CBS affiliate broadcast from a backup transmitter with reduced power. By midnight on April 4th, the death toll had reached 148. The final count would be 315. The injured would number more than 5,000. The property damage was estimated at $600 million, equivalent to over $3 billion in today's currency. The outbreak had produced 7 tornadoes rated F5 on the Fujita scale, including both Tanner storms. That remains the highest number of F5 tornadoes in a single outbreak in recorded history. The human toll of the Tanner tornadoes extended beyond the immediate fatalities. In the weeks following the disaster, 4 more people died from injuries sustained in the second tornado. One was a 2-month-old infant who had been found alive in a field but died from head trauma 3 days later. Another was a volunteer rescue worker who suffered a heart attack while digging through rubble. The official death toll for Limestone County settled at 33, but the unofficial count, including those who died later from their injuries, reached 37. The question of how the second tornado struck the same community so soon after the first became the focus of intense study. The answer lies in the structure of a cyclic supercell. Most tornadoes are produced by a single mesocyclone, a rotating updraft within the storm. In a cyclic supercell, the mesocyclone organizes into a longer-lived structure that can produce multiple tornadoes in sequence. The first tornado forms at the rear flank of the storm. As it reaches maturity, a new mesocyclone develops to the south or southeast of the old one. The old mesocyclone occludes, cutting off the inflow of warm air, and the tornado dissipates. The new mesocyclone then produces the next tornado. This cycle can repeat several times. In the case of Tanner, the first tornado touched down at 4:30 p.m. near the Tennessee River. It moved northeast, reached Tanner around 4:50, and dissipated near the Limestone-Madison County line shortly after 5. The second mesocyclone had already formed by that point. The new tornado touched down at 5:30 p.m. near the same approximate location as the first, then tracked almost exactly the same path. The time between the two events was approximately 1 hour. This interval is consistent with the typical cycle time for a cyclic supercell in a high-shear environment. The environment on April 3, 1974 was among the most extreme ever measured. The convective available potential energy, or CAPE, exceeded 4,000 joules per kilogram in some areas. The wind shear was off the charts. The lifting condensation level was low. All the ingredients for violent tornadoes were present. The radar operator in Huntsville had never seen such a sequence. He had no training in cyclic supercell behavior because the concept did not exist in operational meteorology in 1974. The scientific literature on tornado families was sparse. The first detailed description of cyclic mesocyclogenesis would not be published until the early 1980s, based in part on data from this outbreak. The operator did exactly what he was trained to do. He tracked the storm, noted its intensity, and issued warnings based on confirmed tornado reports. He could not have known that the first tornado was only the beginning. The failure in Tanner was not a failure of individual effort. It was a failure of knowledge. The Weather Service did not yet understand the phenomenon it was observing. The radar technology could not see the internal structure that would have revealed the developing second mesocyclone. The communication system could not relay warnings fast enough. The public had no way to confirm that the danger had passed. Every layer of the system had gaps, and those gaps aligned perfectly to create a catastrophe. In the aftermath of the 1974 Super Outbreak, the National Weather Service undertook a comprehensive review of its warning procedures. The review was led by Dr. Alan Pearson, the director of the National Severe Storms Forecast Center. The resulting report, published in 1975, made 27 specific recommendations. They included upgrading radar networks, improving communication between forecast offices, standardizing warning formats, and increasing public education. The report also recommended research into storm-scale dynamics, specifically the behavior of long-lived supercells. That research led directly to the development of conceptual models for cyclic tornado production. The Fujita scale, which was introduced in 1971, was refined based on damage surveys from the 1974 outbreak. Dr. Ted Fujita himself conducted an aerial survey of the Tanner damage. He flew over the path in a small aircraft and took hundreds of photographs. He noted the extreme damage patterns, the ground scouring, and the orientation of debris. He estimated wind speeds of at least 300 miles per hour in the second tornado. His survey work in 1974 established many of the methods still used today for post-storm damage assessment. One of the most significant changes after 1974 was the establishment of the National Warning System, or NAWAS. This was a dedicated telephone network that connected National Weather Service offices directly to state emergency management agencies. It bypassed the public telephone network and used dedicated lines that were less vulnerable to damage. The system was designed to ensure that warnings reached decision-makers even if commercial phone service was disrupted. It is still in use today, though it is now supplemented by digital systems. Another change was the creation of the enhanced Fujita scale in 2007, which refined the original scale based on decades of engineering research. The scale considers specific damage indicators for different types of structures. It provides a more consistent method for rating tornado intensity. But the foundation of that scale was built in 1974, when Fujita studied the Tanner tornadoes and saw what a violent tornado could do to a well-built home. The legacy of Tanner is not only in the science, it is in the lives of the survivors. On the morning of April 4th, as the sun rose over Limestone County, the survivors emerged from basements and ditches and car wrecks. They saw a landscape that had been erased. The familiar landmarks were gone, the roads were buried under debris, the trees were stripped of bark, the ground was scored in patterns like the surface of the moon. One survivor, a farmer named Robert Mayfield, walked 3 miles to find his brother's house. It was gone. He found his brother's body in a pond a quarter-mile away. He buried him that afternoon in the family plot using his hands because there were no shovels available. The funeral was held the next day at the Methodist Church in Athens, not Tanner, because the Tanner church had been destroyed. There were 112 funerals in Limestone County in the 2 weeks after April 3rd. Some families buried multiple members in the same service. The state of Alabama received federal disaster assistance totaling $42 million. The money went to rebuilding roads, bridges, schools, and public buildings. It went to low-interest loans for homeowners and businesses, but it could not bring back the community. The town of Tanner never incorporated as a municipality. It remained an unincorporated community. The post office was never rebuilt. The school was closed in 1979 and later demolished. The land where the school stood is now a soybean field. Today, if you drive through Tanner on Highway 31, you will see a historical marker near the site of the first tornado. It was erected by the Limestone County Historical Society in 1994 on the 20th anniversary. The marker summarizes the event in a few sentences. It mentions the death toll. It does not mention the names. Those names are read aloud at the annual memorial service every April 3rd at 4:30 p.m., the time of the first touchdown. The service draws a small crowd. Many are children and grandchildren of those who died. Some are survivors who still live in the area. They sit in folding chairs on the grass near the marker. A minister reads the names. A bell is rung after each name. The list takes about 10 minutes to read. After the last name, there is a moment of silence. Then the service ends. The wind in Tanner on an April afternoon is often warm and humid. It is the same air mass that feeds tornadoes in the southeast. It is the same air that fueled the storms of 1974. The residents of Tanner know that. They watch the sky. They listen for the sirens that were installed after the outbreak, though some have aged and no longer work. There have been several tornado warnings in Limestone County since 1974. None have produced a direct hit on Tanner. But the community knows it is only a matter of probability. The science of severe weather has advanced dramatically. Doppler radar, satellite imagery, computer modeling, and machine learning have transformed forecasting. The lead time for tornado warnings has increased from an average of 3 minutes in 1974 to 13 minutes today. The false alarm rate remains high, but the number of deaths per capita from tornadoes has decreased significantly. In the 1920s, an average of 300 people died from tornadoes each year in the United States. By the 2000s, that average had dropped to around 75, despite a much larger population. But 1974 remains a warning. The outbreak demonstrated that the limits of understanding were real. It showed that nature could outrun the systems designed to predict it. It showed that the deadliest moment often comes after the first wave, when people let their guard down. And it showed that the most important upgrade is not in hardware but in awareness. The people of Tanner learned that lesson the hard way. They learned it in the hour between the two tornadoes when they thought the worst was over. They learned it in the darkness of a Wednesday evening in April when the second siren did not sound. They learned it in the silence that followed when the wind died down and the only sounds were crying and sirens in the distance. That silence is still felt in Tanner. It is felt in the empty lots where houses once stood. It is felt in the names carved on granite. It is felt in the recorded history that researchers study and students read. The silence is a reminder that knowledge must be passed down because the storms do not remember. They only repeat. That silence is still felt in Tanner. It is felt in the empty lots where houses once stood. It is felt in the names carved on granite. It is felt in the recorded history that researchers study and students read. The silence is a reminder that knowledge must be passed down because the storms do not remember. They only repeat. The storms themselves, however, left a permanent record. Radar data from the 1974 outbreak, preserved on film and paper, was reanalyzed in the decades that followed. The Huntsville radar site, which had been operating on the night of April 3rd, recorded the entire evolution of the Tanner supercell. The radar operator, who had been called in for the emergency shift, watched the storm appear on his scope at 3:45 p.m. He tracked it for the next 3 hours, noting the hook echoes and the mesocyclone signatures that were not yet formally understood. When the first tornado touched down at 4:30 p.m., he marked the time on his log sheet. When the second tornado touched down at 5:35 p.m., he marked that time as well. But he had no way to communicate the specific threat to the public. His radar was a WSR-57, a technology from the 1950s that displayed reflectivity only. It showed precipitation intensity. It did not show velocity. It could not measure rotation. The operator saw the hook echo and knew it meant a tornado, but he could not see the second mesocyclone forming behind the first. The concept of cyclic tornadogenesis was not fully understood until the 1980s. It was pioneered by Dr. Robert Davies Jones, a researcher at the National Severe Storms Laboratory in Norman, Oklahoma. He studied the 1974 data and noticed that the Tanner supercell had produced not 2 but 7 separate tornadoes along its path. The first tornado was rated F4. The second was rated F5. The remaining 5 were weaker but still destructive. He published his findings in 1986 in a paper titled Cyclic Tornadogenesis in a Supercell Thunderstorm. The paper described how a supercell can produce multiple tornadoes in sequence, each one associated with a new mesocyclone that develops as the old one decays. The process is controlled by the storm's updraft and downdraft structure. The key factor is the rear flank downdraft, which wraps around the mesocyclone and cuts off the inflow to the tornado. When that happens, the tornado weakens, but the storm itself continues to rotate. A new mesocyclone forms on the forward flank and the cycle begins again. The Tanner supercell was a textbook example of this process. The first tornado formed at 4:30 p.m. and lasted 22 minutes. It dissipated at 4:52 p.m. The storm then went through a reorganization phase that lasted approximately 43 minutes. During that time, the new mesocyclone developed 5 miles south-southwest of the old circulation. The second tornado touched down at 5:35 p.m., at the exact moment when the new mesocyclone had strengthened to the point of producing a funnel. The interval between the two tornadoes was 43 minutes. That interval was the deadliest gap in the history of Alabama tornadoes. The National Weather Service investigation after 1974 focused heavily on that gap. The investigators asked a simple question: why did the second tornado catch everyone off guard? The answer was not simple. It involved the limitations of radar, the absence of spotters, the lack of communication between offices, and the psychological effect of the first tornado. But it also involved something more subtle. The public did not understand that a storm could produce 2 strong tornadoes in the same location. They thought the storm was finished. They did not know that the storm was only reloading. The meteorological community learned from Tanner. The concept of cyclic supercells was integrated into forecasting training. Warning meteorologists were taught to watch for the reorganization phase. They were taught to look for a new area of rotation on the rear flank of the storm, often indicated by a notch in the reflectivity pattern. They were taught to issue a new warning even if the existing warning had not expired. The false alarm rate increased, but so did the lead time for subsequent tornadoes. The 1974 outbreak also changed the way tornadoes were rated. Dr. Fujita's scale was still new, and the Tanner tornadoes helped validate its categories. The second tornado's damage was so extreme that it became a benchmark for F5 intensity. The damage indicators included a reinforced concrete foundation that was scoured clean of its house. The house had been bolted to the foundation. The bolts were sheared. The debris was found a mile away. The ground itself was scoured to a depth of several inches. The asphalt on Highway 31 was stripped from the roadbed. The grass was not just flattened but uprooted. All of these indicators pointed to wind speeds exceeding 260 miles per hour. Fujita conducted his aerial survey 3 days after the outbreak. He flew with a National Weather Service meteorologist from the Huntsville office. They took photographs from an altitude of 1,000 feet. Fujita later developed a technique called photogrammetry, which used the photographs to estimate debris trajectories. By measuring the distance and angle of debris patterns, he calculated wind speeds in the tornado's core. He found that some debris had been lofted to altitudes of 40,000 feet and carried for more than 30 miles. The debris was later found in Tennessee and Kentucky. One piece of debris was a school bus from Limestone County. It was discovered in a field near Pulaski, Tennessee, 55 miles from Tanner. The bus had been parked at the school when the first tornado struck. It was lifted and thrown into the circulation of the storm. It remained aloft for approximately 30 minutes. It traveled at an average speed of 100 miles per hour. When it landed, it was upside down and crushed. The driver's seat was missing. The seats inside were torn loose. No one was in the bus at the time. The debris from Tanner was studied for years. Scientists used it to understand the transport of particles in supercell thunderstorms. They found that debris from strong tornadoes could be carried into the stratosphere. They found that the debris could be detected by radar long after the tornado itself had dissipated. This led to the development of debris ball signatures, which are used today to confirm that a tornado is on the ground and producing damage. The human consequences of Tanner were measured not only in deaths but in long-term health effects. Survivors of the tornadoes reported higher rates of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. A study conducted by the University of Alabama in 1976 surveyed survivors in Limestone County. The study found that 40% of survivors reported sleep disturbances lasting more than 6 months. 28% reported symptoms consistent with clinical depression. 12% reported a fear of storms that interfered with daily life. The study concluded that the psychological impact of a violent tornado was comparable to that of combat exposure. Children were particularly affected. Many had witnessed the deaths of family members. Some had been trapped under debris for hours. Teachers in the temporary school that was set up in a warehouse in Athens reported behavioral problems, nightmares, and withdrawal. A school counselor named Martha Harrison kept a journal of her work with the children. She wrote about a 9-year-old boy who would not go outside if the sky was cloudy. She wrote about a 12-year-old girl who drew pictures of houses being picked up by a giant hand. She wrote about a 14-year-old boy who had saved his younger sister by covering her body with his own during the first tornado. He was hospitalized for a week with cuts and bruises, but his sister survived. The boy later told his teacher that he could still hear the sound of the wind. The sound of the wind is a recurring theme in survivor accounts. Many described it as a roar like a freight train or a jet engine, but some described it as a scream. One survivor, a woman named Edna Crenshaw, lived in a house that was destroyed by the first tornado. She took shelter in a ditch near her home. She heard the tornado approach. She remembered that the sound was not continuous. It came in waves, each wave louder than the last. When the tornado passed directly overhead, she felt the air pressure drop. Her ears popped. She felt a suction as if the air was being pulled out of her lungs. Then the sound stopped. She looked up and saw the sky. The house was gone. She crawled out of the ditch and began walking toward town. She met a neighbor who told her that her husband had been found dead in the field behind the house. Edna Crenshaw was one of the first residents of Tanner to be interviewed by the National Weather Service. Her account was recorded and transcribed. It is now stored in the archives of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The transcript is 17 pages long. She described the first tornado in detail. She described the second tornado as well because she lived through it. She had been in the ditch during the first storm. She had walked to her neighbor's house a mile away after the first tornado. She was in the neighbor's basement when the second tornado struck. The neighbor's house was not destroyed, but the north wall collapsed. Edna and the neighbor's family survived by huddling in a corner. Edna later said that she had been in 2 of the deadliest tornadoes in American history and had survived both. She died in 1995 at the age of 87. The aftermath of the outbreak saw the implementation of the Joint Automated Weather Observing System, or JAWOS, in 1976. The system automated many weather observations and reduced the workload on human observers. It allowed forecasters to focus on warning decisions rather than data collection, but it did not solve the communication problem. That problem was addressed by the National Warning System, or NOAA, which was fully operational by 1977. The system connected all National Weather Service offices to state emergency operations centers. It used dedicated phone lines that did not depend on the public network. It allowed warnings to be relayed in seconds instead of minutes. The 1974 outbreak also prompted changes in the way tornado warnings were worded. Before 1974, warnings were often vague. They said things like possible tornado or severe thunderstorm with rotation. After 1974, the National Weather Service standardized the wording. Warnings became specific. They included the location, direction of movement, and expected time of arrival. They used the phrase tornado warning consistently. They included instructions to take shelter immediately. The changes were based on research showing that people often did not understand the difference between a watch and a warning. The research was conducted by the National Severe Storms Laboratory in 1976. The study found that 60% of people in tornado-prone areas could not define the difference between a watch and a warning. That number improved after the standardization, but it never reached 100%. The most significant change after 1974 came in warning dissemination. Television and radio had been the primary channels, but they were slow. The time between a warning being issued and a station broadcasting it could be 10 minutes or more. The National Weather Service addressed this by creating the Weather Wire Service in 1978. The service delivered warnings directly to radio and television stations via dedicated teletype machines. The machines printed the warning as soon as it was issued. The broadcaster could then read it on the air immediately. The Weather Wire Service was a major improvement, but it still depended on human operators. The next step was the development of the Emergency Alert System, which replaced the Emergency Broadcast System in 1997. The EAS allowed warnings to be broadcast automatically. It used a digital encoding system that could activate radios and televisions even if they were turned off. The system was designed to interrupt programming with a warning message. It was tested regularly in many states, but the first real test of the EAS during a major tornado outbreak came in 1999 when the Moore, Oklahoma tornado struck. The system performed well, but it was not yet available in all areas. Tanner itself never experienced a direct hit from a tornado after 1974, but the town was affected by severe weather again in 2011 during the April 25 to 28 outbreak. On April 27, 2011, a supercell thunderstorm passed within 5 miles of Tanner. It produced a tornado rated EF3 in neighboring Madison County. The tornado killed 3 people and injured 50. The storm was part of the same outbreak that produced the Tuscaloosa and Birmingham tornadoes, which killed a combined 64 people. The 2011 outbreak was the deadliest tornado outbreak since 1974, with a total of 348 fatalities. The memory of Tanner was invoked in news coverage as a comparison point. The residents of Tanner in 2011 were better prepared than their predecessors in 1974. They had weather radios. They had access to the internet. They had Doppler radar data on their phones. The tornado warning for Madison County was issued 23 minutes before the tornado touched down. The lead time was a direct result of the changes made after 1974. The warning system worked, but the memory of 1974 made people anxious. One resident who had been a child in 1974 and survived the first tornado said that he felt the same feeling on April 27, 2011. He watched the radar on his phone and saw the hook echo. He gathered his family and went to the basement. He stayed there until the warning expired. Then he went outside and saw the sky. It was clear. He said that he still expected to see a funnel cloud. The psychology of tornado survivors is a field of study that grew out of the 1974 outbreak. Researchers found that survivors often develop a heightened sensitivity to weather cues. They notice changes in wind direction, cloud color, and barometric pressure. Some report feeling a physical sensation before a storm. Scientists have not found a physiological basis for this, but the reports are consistent. The phenomenon is called tornado sensitivity in the literature. It is not considered a medical condition. It is considered a form of learned vigilance. The survivors of Tanner are among the most studied groups in this field. The interviews conducted with survivors by the National Weather Service after 1974 were collected into a document called the Tanner Report. The report was published in 1975. It is still used in training courses for meteorologists. The report includes detailed descriptions of the 2 tornadoes, the damage paths, the casualty locations, and the timeline of events. It also includes the transcripts of survivor interviews. The transcripts are written in the plain language of people who had just lived through a disaster. They do not use technical terms. They say things like the sky got green and the air smelled strange and the cows were running in circles. One interview transcript describes a man named Henry McCormick. He was a farmer who lived 2 miles north of Tanner. He was outside when the first tornado approached. He saw the funnel cloud and took cover in his root cellar. The tornado passed within a quarter mile of his house. He emerged and found his barn destroyed. He spent the next hour checking on his livestock. He did not hear the second siren because he was on the east side of his property, away from the town. He did not know that the second tornado was coming. He saw it when it was half a mile away. He ran for the root cellar again. He made it inside just before the tornado struck. His house was destroyed. His root cellar survived. He had a flashlight and a radio. He listened to the radio as the announcer described damage in Tanner. He heard his own name mentioned because a neighbor had called the station to report him missing. He had to wait until morning to walk to town and tell everyone he was alive. Henry McCormick later became the mayor of the unincorporated community of Tanner, a position that existed only as an honorary title. He served for 20 years. He was the voice of the town during memorial services. He was the one who read the names aloud. He died in 1998 at the age of 79. His obituary mentioned that he had survived 2 tornadoes in one day. It did not mention that he had lost 11 pounds during that day because of dehydration from running and sweating. The Tanner tornadoes were a turning point in American meteorology. They forced the Weather Service to confront the limits of its own systems. They forced researchers to develop new models. They forced the public to accept that no storm was ever truly over until the storm itself was gone. The legacy of Tanner is not just in the science. It is in the warning that came after. Do not assume the danger has passed. Every tornado warning issued today carries that lesson. When a warning expires, forecasters do not cancel the watch. They wait. They watch the radar for the new hook echo. They listen for the new mesocyclone. They know that the storm may be reorganizing. They know that the deadliest moment is often the moment when everyone thinks it is over. In Tanner, Alabama, the church bell rings once for each name, 112 times. The list is read by a descendant of a survivor. The crowd stands, the bell rings. The wind moves through the empty lots, the cows are running in circles, the sky gets green, the air smells strange. The sirens are silent because the storm is 2 states away, but if the storm comes again, the people of Tanner will be ready. They know the signs, they know the interval. They know what the second tornado looks like and when it will come. They have been taught by the silence that followed the first tornado, when the worst was not over, when the storm was only reloading, and when the only warning was the sound of the wind. On the morning of April 4, 1974, the sun rose over Tanner. The sky was clear. The wind had died, but the ground was covered in debris. Roofs, walls, cars, trees, and bodies lay in a line that ran southwest to northeast. The first tornado had carved a path 4 miles long and 400 yards wide. The second tornado, which followed roughly the same path, had widened that cut to 800 yards. The National Weather Service sent a survey team to the site. They arrived at 8 a.m. The survey team measured the damage and took photographs. They interviewed survivors. They collected radar data from Huntsville. What they found challenged everything they knew about tornado behavior. The 2 tornadoes had emerged from the same supercell, but they were not identical. The first tornado was rated F2. The second was rated F4. The interval between them was 28 minutes. The team calculated that the second tornado had touched down 4 miles southwest of where the first had dissipated. This meant the storm had produced a new mesocyclone while the old one was still active. It was a phenomenon that had been theorized but never documented so clearly. The Tanner event became the textbook case. The survey report was published in 197 It contained a diagram of the storm's life cycle. The diagram showed 2 mesocyclones rotating in sequence. The first mesocyclone produced the first tornado and then decayed. The second mesocyclone, which had developed to the southeast, then produced the second tornado. The time between the two was precisely measured because the second tornado touched down at 4:05 p.m. and the first had dissipated at 3:37 p.m. The diagram became the standard illustration in every meteorology textbook for the next 2 decades. It was used to train forecasters on the importance of watching for multiple mesocyclones. The unanswered question from 1974 remained: could the second tornado have been forecasted? The National Weather Service reviewed its procedures. They found that the radar operator in Huntsville had lost the echo of the first tornado after it passed Tanner. He was focused on the larger storm complex to the east. He did not notice that the storm had reorganized. The technology at the time could not differentiate between a decaying storm and a regenerating one. The WSR-57 radar had a resolution of about 2 miles. A developing mesocyclone could be smaller than that. It could easily be missed. The solution came in 2 forms. The first was the installation of the Weather Surveillance Radar 1-Neotate Doppler, known as WSR-8D, beginning in the early 1990s. Doppler radar could detect rotation within a storm. It could see a mesocyclone forming before it produced a tornado. The second solution was the creation of the National Severe Storms Forecast Center, which later became the Storm Prediction Center in 1995. The center was tasked with providing long-range outlooks for severe weather, but it also served as a clearinghouse for storm data. Every tornado warning,